Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much, everybody. And this presentation is a nice lead-on from what Bryony was talking about. So I'm grateful for what she said. And some of the slides that you'll be seeing here were presented yesterday. So if you were here yesterday and you were sleepy, well, this is your chance to see the slides. And I've been involved in impact assessment for about 30 years, so I'm giving my best overview of where we need to go as impact assessors to be current with what's happening in the world today. When I say current, we like to be cool, right? I think there's an element of coolness to our work. We want to be seen as cool and trendy and with the times. And so, you know, is this a cool EA practitioner? That's me at age 16. Dead sexy, right? Fashion's changed and EA methodologies change, and are we going to be sticking with them? Because really we want to look like this, right? That's where we want to be. So practitioners must be at the top of their game. The world is changing, and the change that is happening in the world is best captured by a quote from the 1700s from Voltaire. Men argue, nature acts. And regardless of who signs agreements and who signs conventions and doesn't implement or does implement, we're in a very difficult situation right now. So considering after more than 50 years of impact assessment practice, since 1969, we are seeing these things that's hitting the shores now: climate extremes, floods and fires, food prices variable around the world. That cauliflower to the right there is from my city in Ottawa, and that cauliflower was $8 because of water shortages in California. Fires, lots of fires and floods. Planetary boundaries. You've seen this slide before, I'm sure. There's 9 planetary boundaries that keep us vertical and ventilating, that keep us alive. 3 have been exceeded. Biodiversity's been exceeded, nitrogen and carbon, all exceeded. The next one that's in the wings is ocean acidification. If that happens, we've got some very serious problems. Just a few months ago, the Living Planet report came out by World Wildlife Fund. Not very encouraging reading. Geo6 report came out recently. Again, not very encouraging reading. And next week, the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, who are now meeting in Paris right now, are going to release their report, and that report, too, is not very encouraging reading as far as what's happening in the world. Basically, what all these reports are saying is that we are at tipping points on very many areas of planetary boundaries. Tipping points on biodiversity loss, nitrogen, plastics, whatever. We are now breathing plastics and excreting plastics. That's now a known fact. In our own waste stream, we are excreting plastics. Not a good thing. But we're seeing some changes around the world happening. I think these are quite significant. One of them is the movement that Greta Thunberg has started, the school strikes. The youth are getting more engaged, very engaged, and that's a very positive thing. And for those that have not seen the Extinction Rebellion movement, that's coming to your city very soon, I bet. It was in Ottawa last week. It's been in Paris. It's moving around the world. So that movement, the Extinction Rebellion, is quite an interesting movement. And that symbol is an hourglass, showing that we're running out of time. Banks are weighing in. I want to spend a bit of time on this. The governor of the Bank of England, that's Mark Carney, a Canadian, he says that $20 trillion in capital investments could be wiped out over the next few years because of climate change. We're seeing this already in infrastructure losses. So he is making a plea to the banking sector and to the investment community that the world needs a massive reallocation of capital that respects climate change risks. That message is speaking to us. When we're talking about reallocation of capital, that means alternatives. We need to help people like this manage risk. Impact assessment is the perfect tool to help bankers like this manage their risk portfolio. We're also seeing statements like this. After 50 years of impact assessment practice, this is a recent report by Bill Lawrence on what he feels impact assessment is doing. It's superficial, it's myopic, It rarely, it's not the right tool for planning for infrastructure. That hurts, right? We like to think we're doing a good job. We like to think we're cool. We like to think we're current. But academics like this doing research on impact assessments around the world see that there are some problems with this practice. So what can we do to get from A to B with our skill set, with this thing that we've been dealing with for 50 years called impact assessment? What can we do, considering the waves that are hitting the shore in the form of community concerns, climate change, investor confidence, such as Mark Carney and the Bank of England, and regulatory regime institutional capacity? Let's have a look at who we are. We're a pretty rare group of individuals on this planet as far as professionals. We know how the world works, whether we're biologists or community developers or physicists or geologists like myself. We have a good sense of how this planet functions from an ecosystem perspective. We have a unique knowledge about the planet. And you know what? When we're doing impact assessments, we're at the core of decision making. Is there any other type of legislation that allows people like us to be at the table with decision makers? There isn't. When it comes to financial planning or other types of planning in government circles, you don't get people like us at the table, but through legislation and impact assessment, that gives us a door into the regulatory process. So we have to use that to our advantage. Now I'm focusing down to what our roles need to be more cool and contemporary. We need to make IAs, we need to make our impact assessments wider. They need to have further reach. We need to be able to reach banks and insurance companies and things like that, not just the client and not just the regulator. We need to challenge. If we're at the decision makers table and talking to the proponents and talking to the regulators who manage these processes, we need to up our game on challenging. We're being paid regardless. We're doing the impact assessments. Our job is to provide information. Our job is not to be a lapdog, to say yes to everything they want. Our job is to provide information and then let the decision maker make the decision. So when we're at the decision maker, we need to ask these kinds of questions. Does your project or program maximize sustainability opportunities for all participants? Do you believe environmental issues are real and now starting to affect your business and communities? And does decide and defend work for you today? If we're going to be current and contemporary, we need to present information and process in front of decision makers that solves problems as opposed to fighting to win. Fighting to win is the old model. It's much better if we can work with developers in a way that convenes and then decide, because the decide and defend process, which impact assessments get in all the time, decide and defend means most impact assessments end up in court. This is very common in Canada. They end up in court. Decide and defend. That is a waste of time, a waste of resources, a waste of patience. And you know what? We don't have time for that on the planet. The International Panel on Climate Change says we've got 12 years to sort this out. We don't have time to be in court to decide and defend. We should get information to decision makers that provides a lot more sustainable opportunities. Perhaps we need to change the language in our impact assessment. Use words like livability, survivability, the future we want. What about putting into our impact assessments statements like this? What are the conditions for success for the desired future? What is the future that that community or that proponent wants? And let's design the project to get there, or the program. Maria Partidario, who's at the conference, has done some really interesting work on critical decision factors, and I invite you to look at Google Maria Partidario and critical decision factors, because that is contemporary thinking on doing impact assessment in a new way. So express critical uncertainties, express risk and opportunities. It's a different way of looking at mitigation and adaptation. In some ways, I feel that mitigation, adaptation is the old way of talking about impact assessments. And what we really should be doing is using more modern terminology, such as critical decision factors. Other roles that impact assessment professionals can play as we move into 2019 and 2020 and so on. Brownie talked about strategic environmental assessment. Yes, we must have more strategic environmental assessment. I think IA has a role to send information to all impact assessment agencies around the world there's probably 160 countries which have impact assessment regulations. Why can't IAIA communicate directly with these organizations about what we do? I talked about critical decision factors being more broadly used. We need to reach out to banks and insurance companies to help them with risk management. And should we be involved in any projects which deal with a heavy carbon footprint? That's a value and ethical decision that an impact assessor might have to make. And regardless of whether you can get an impact assessment to look at the strategic issues facing that project or program, we should, at a minimum, have in every impact assessment some statement about sustainability and how that particular project affects planetary boundaries. Because as I said earlier, all the individual projects around the world are now starting to have cumulative tipping points in the form of nitrogen loading, phosphorus loading, ocean acidification. It's becoming global. Impact assessment is a great tool for patching a hole in a roof on individual projects, but it's not the right process right now for the storm that's coming in. It's going to rip the roof right off. If climate change does really start to run away, we got a problem. If ocean acidification starts running away, we've got a serious problem, and impact assessment is not going to address that. So perhaps the most powerful skill that we have, because we have this unique set of skills and knowledge about the planet, is tell the story. Why can't we use plain and simple language in our impact assessments to tell a compelling story about what that project is going to do? You know, Rachel Carson spoke of Silent Spring. I think that book came out in 1961. And for those that don't know that book, Silent Spring is about the loss of songbirds because of pesticides. That was the call to action in 1961, DDT. And, you know, we've lost now, as I stand here, as we're in this room today, we've lost or are in decline over 50% of songbird species in the world. That is an extremely disturbing statistic. So how can we tell a story in our impact assessment? What's wrong with telling a compelling story as opposed to being academic and technical? Let's reach out and try to touch emotion in our impact assessments. Those emotions are being touched. Last week in Montreal was the Nature Champions Summit. Very influential opinion leaders from around the world and very wealthy philanthropists. There's Harrison Ford, he was at the summit, gathered at the invitation of Canada to try to get this status quo that we're talking about changed so that we get the conversation moving in a better direction. We get investment going in a more sustainable direction. So we'll see what happens out of conversations like that. We don't have another 60 years or 50 years to advance impact assessment. We've got at most 12. We need to sort this out now. So the takeaway messages for you, and for myself too, is we are at the core of decision making. That's a unique opportunity. No one else in the private sector as a consultant really has such a door to proponents and decision makers through legislation. Let's start using that opportunity more strategically. And once we're inside that door, let's challenge. Let's challenge for more sustainable decisions. Let's change the language, and let's change the approach. Perhaps instead of talking about adaptation and mitigation, let's talk about critical decision factors. Use SEA, provide real alternatives. IAIA has to become, I think, more vocal in what we do to convince banks and insurance companies to invite us to their tables to show how we can manage risk. And lastly, tell the whole story in a very compelling way. And lastly, this is a message from the Hopi tribe in the United States. We are the ones we've been waiting for. That's a cool statement. Who else is going to change impact assessment practice but us? The ones that are in the room right now, and all members of IAA and all impact assessment professionals. If we see problems in the global community, if we see problems with bird species, if we see problems with the way things are going, then we're the ones that have to make the change. I don't think there's anybody in this room that hasn't been touched emotionally by some of the issues that are facing this world. There are some things that keep me awake at night, and one of them is what's happening to this wonderful planet. And for those that want to maybe listen to a compelling story, I invite you to listen to a spoken word poem by Shane Koizan called Shoulders. It's on the web, it's on YouTube. Shoulders by Shane Koizan. It's a 7-minute spoken word poem, and it tells the story, and it tells what we need to do. So I want to thank you for your attention. I hope this has made some sense. I hope that you can leave this conference thinking about maybe changing your practice and looking at different ways of doing things so that we can tell the story and move into a more sustainable impact assessment realm. Thank you very much, and let's talk. Thank you.